Hello everyone, my name is Nikki Kimbark and the subject I have chosen to do my project on is Queen Mary. In this project I will be queering Queen Mary. So let's begin. Who is Queen Mary? Before we dive deep into that question, I think first we must understand what I am dissecting in this analysis. What do I mean when I say I am queering Queen Mary? Hardcore Queen Mary fans, please do not worry, I'm not exposing her for being a secret lesbian or anything of that sort. When I say queer, I mean things that belong in the non-normative, within society. What does this mean exactly? Well, society is an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteronormative, ableist, theistic patriarchy. Try saying that 5 times fast. In other words, able-bodied white cisgender men are the ones who benefit the most in society. Queen Mary, as a descendant of George III, lived a very privileged life. In her position as princess and eventual queen of England forced her to uphold these imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteronormative, ableist, theistic, patriarchal values ingrained in her society. But her identity as a woman in a patriarchal society automatically places her as an other. An other is someone who does not fit the role of an able-bodied white cisgender man. In this analysis, I will be examining Queen Mary's role as Queen of England through a queer lens. Now, because she has spent her entire life upholding these patriarchal values, it is likely this examination will heavily rely on reading between the lines. The reason I chose to do my project on Queen Mary is because of that spark Susan Ware speaks about in her article called The Book I Couldn't Write, where she discusses her struggles with writing about Alice Paul. I love everything about the Windsor royal family, but like Ware, the research for this project became difficult at times. But I wouldn't call it failure as she describes in her article. Part 1 begins with who is Queen Mary? Queen Mary, or Princess Victoria Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes of Teck, was born on the 26th of May in 1867. Mary of Teck was born in the same room as Queen Mary at Kensington Palace. She was the oldest and the only daughter of Prince Francis, the Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide, a granddaughter of George III, the guy who lost America. Family and close friends called her May. Her family were lower-rank royals, and her mother's hefty spending with their royal allowance forced them into debt. She became engaged to the Duke of Clarence, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, who was the future Edward VIII, and he became the future King of England in 1891. So she became engaged to him in 1891. Unfortunately, the Duke of Clarence died in 1892, but due to Queen Victoria liking her so much, Princess May of Teck married his younger brother, Prince George, the Duke of York, who is the future King George V in 1893. Their marriage, though reserved, was a fairly happy one. Unlike his father, Edward VIII, who was notorious for his affairs with women, George V never took a mistress during his marriage. But they really didn't show their love publicly. They weren't very affectionate people. They weren't affectionate towards each other or towards their children. They had 6 children, 5 sons and 1 daughter: David, Albert, Mary, Harry, George, and John, although everyone knew them as Prince or King or Princess. 2 of her sons became kings of England: Edward VIII, who abdicated in favor of marrying American divorcee Wallis Simpson, and George VI, the current Queen's father. So, for anyone confused by what I just said, Queen Mary was the paternal grandmother to the current Queen Elizabeth II, the mother of Queen Elizabeth II's father, George VI, and wife to George V. So Queen Mary served as Queen Consort to George V from May 1910 to January 1936. A lot of this information comes from my previous research of Queen Mary, but the book called The Quest for Queen Mary by James Pope Hennessy has a really great timeline that covers her life, from her birth to her death in 1953. I feel like I summarized her life here a bit too quickly, but that's because this project isn't about giving you guys her life story. This project is about dissecting the queer or the non-normative parts of herself that are often overlooked by most biographers. Something this class has emphasized on since our first few discussions. Now, Queen Mary is not the average woman you would imagine when you think of feminism or womanhood of the 1920s and the 1930s. In fact, based on my research, I would argue she would not identify as a feminist. Royals are notorious for being non-political, and I would argue that feminism and politics kind of go hand in hand. Their non-politicalness is one of the reasons why the Windsor family, aka the British family, survived World War I, while their cousins, Tsar Nicholas and William II, did not. But I would not consider her unopinionated, since she just kept those opinions private. For example, she disapproved of her eldest son's relationship and eventual marriage to Wallis Simpson. She was brought up to believe duty always came first, while personal feelings and desires always needed to take a back seat. In my research, I came across this passage from the matriarch Queen Mary in the House of Windsor by Anne Edwards, which I think is a great example of her belief that duty comes first over anything, including family. And I'll read this passage to you now. Quote, "On a clear winter night in 1936, King Edward VIII publicly renounced the throne for the woman I love. After his famous broadcast made from Windsor Castle, he returned to nearby Royal Lodge, where his mother, sister, and 3 brothers, the older of whom was now king, had listened to the speech. His younger brother could not contain his emotion. He shook his head and cried almost fiercely, 'It isn't possible! It isn't happening!' Tall and elegant, her silver hair piled high, ropes of pearls swirling down the front of her gray clipped chiffon gown, Queen Mary showed no outward signs of emotions. She asked for her coat, and her daughter prepared to leave with her for London and her home at Marlborough House. Her 4 sons followed her out into the hallway. 'Goodbye, David. God be with you,' she said to the son who for 10 months had been Great Britain's uncrowned king. Then she turned to her second son, the lean, nervous, stuttering young man with the slightly bulging, rabbity eyes, to whom she knew this unexpected happening in his life was a severe blow, and she curtsied. 'God save the king,' she said clearly, and then departed, leaving her eldest son with the distinct feeling that with her words, one king had been enthroned and another created. For him, his mother, Queen Mary, had always been the very essence of monarchy." Unquote. And to highlight one of the lines in this passage, Queen Mary showed no outward sign of emotion. The abdication of Edward VIII caused a large rift in the royal family, and I even noticed in the Netflix series The Crown, it always seems to mark this event as where all the problems for the family started. The show even blames Edward VIII's abdication as the reason for sending the Queen Mother's disabled cousins to an asylum this latest season. But that's another story, and that's about the show, not about Queen Mary. We're focusing on Queen Mary and how this abdication affected her. Although publicly we do not know Queen Mary's true feelings towards her eldest son's choice to choose marriage over duty, a letter she wrote to her son paints a clearer picture of how she might have felt. So I'm going to read you another passage, and this is a letter to her son. So, quote, "You asked me in your letter of the 23rd of June to write to you frankly about my true feelings with regard to you and the present position, and this I will do now. You will remember how miserable I was when you informed me of your intended marriage and abdication, and how I implored you not to do so for our sake and for the sake of the country. You did not seem able to take any point of view but your own. I do not think you have ever realized the shock which the attitude you took up caused your family and the whole nation. It seemed inconceivable to those who made such sacrifices during the war that you, as their king, refused a lesser sacrifice. My feelings for you as your mother remain the same, and our being parted and the cause of it grieve me beyond words. After all my life I have put my country before everything else, and I simply cannot change now." Unquote. We like to glamorize and romanticize the royal family. We like to view the royal family as different from the average Joe, but the truth is they are just humans, with wealthier ancestors than most of us, mind you. They live and they die like the rest of us. Queen Mary was a wealthier woman of her time, but she is still bound by patriarchal traditions. If anything, she is even more oppressed than most women because she does not have the authority to express her true feelings or fight the patriarchal power. What would people think if Queen Mary herself stood side by side with English women who were fighting for equal rights or the right to vote? And it almost sounds unimaginable, really. I can easily imagine the Lady Diana Spencer doing something of that sort, but not Queen Mary. Queen Mary was raised to be a traditionalist and to be conservative. The feminist movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s went against everything she was taught. She was born to produce kings, and that's about it. I find it funny how Queen Victoria, who was the first cousin of Queen Mary's mother, Mary Adelaide, ruled the country for so long, from 1837 to 1901, and yet the country still had patriarchal values. She followed tradition where her son, even though he was the second born, had more authority and power than his older sister, Princess Victoria. This shows how women in patriarchal societies enforce sexist ideals onto their children, and Queen Mary was no different here. In my research, I remember hearing how Queen Mary only regretted one thing in her life: never learning how to ride a bicycle. I think this shows how little freedom she truly had as an individual in society. She was born into a system that made her second to her brothers, and then to her husband, and eventually to her sons. But really the men in the hierarchy are oppressed as well, because they were born into a system where they also come second to the crown. So for royals, it is the crown first, king second, queens third, and everyone else somewhere below them. I don't want to say that Queen Mary was oppressed and she hated her life, because she didn't, and that's not the truth at all. In her eyes, I don't think she would see herself as being oppressed. This patriarchal confinement was all that she knew, and it was normalized in her family and in her elite society. If she questioned it, or any of her family or the friends that she had questioned it. They would simply be told that it was just how things were, and it should not be questioned. It feels odd to say Queen Mary was a victim of oppression, and the way she lived was wrong, because that is simply not the truth. It's like saying to a woman in Iran that she is oppressed and that my way of living or my Western viewpoint is the right way without knowing or fully understanding how this woman in Iran truly lived. In a patriarchy, a woman will always be oppressed, whether this woman lives in Iran or the United Kingdom, whether they are part of the poorest family in the world or part of the richest family in the world. A woman in a man's world is oppressed. Simple as that. This class focuses mainly on women of color, which makes finding readings from this semester to relate to Queen Mary as is a bit difficult to find. Again, she was a white woman who was a literal queen. She relates little to important figures we've learned, like Josephine Baker and Adela Slasvinto, but that does not make her story or her struggles any less significant than theirs. Oppression is not a competition. A woman who is most oppressed in society is not better or more important than a woman who is least oppressed in society. Though Queen Mary was not an activist in the same way Baker and Slasvinto were, she did do things to uplift and help her community. In my research, I found this pamphlet documenting her visit to a hospital. Queen Mary's royal privilege allowed her to do things most of the people we've learned and researched about this semester could not. She and the other members of the royal family participated in charities, gave to the poor, gave to the ill. Whether she wanted to do these things is a different question, but she still did them. She could have secretly despised helping the poor and the sick, for all we knew, but only she really knew the truth. But based on my assessment of her, I think she saw charities and donations as part of her duty as a royal or a queen consort. It didn't really matter whether she liked helping people or not. It just came with the job. Her feelings towards the matter was irrelevant. Duty dominated over feelings all the time. And that is essentially why I argue her queerness. People often look at the many privileges the royal family has, but the burdens they have are just as important. Like polyamory, Queen Mary was trapped in this system of oppression. Her identities placed her in a position in society. The only difference between Queen Mary and polyamory and the other women we've learned about in this semester is her privileges outweighed her oppressions, whereas polyamory and the other women, their oppressions outweighed their privileges for the majority of it. And so in my introduction of Queen Mary, I mentioned she had 6 children. Her youngest, Prince John, was an epileptic and he died quite young. Another son, Prince George, died in World War II. And finally, her son, George VI, died in 1952. From a mother's perspective, outliving 3 of your 6 children must have been heartbreaking. You want the best for your children. And we so often see her as Queen Mary, wife, mother, grandmother to monarchs, but we hardly ever view her as, and other royals, as human. She's more than just a royal, and this is exactly why it is important to look at Queen Mary through a queer lens. And I hope this analysis of her today gives you a queer perspective on who Queen Mary was as a person in society. So thank you for listening. Goodbye.